One night in April of 1919, a middle-aged man named Eric Marth woke up in his bedroom in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because his entire bed was shaking. He saw his wife, Margaret, was lying next to him and she was thrashing around and gasping for air. But Eric didn't panic because he knew exactly what was happening. So Eric and Margaret had moved into this house just a few weeks ago, but pretty much right away after moving in, Margaret had begun having these very intense nightmares that would wake her up almost violently, like what was happening right now. Now, from Eric's perspective, these nightmares she was having looked horrifying, but there really was not any physical risk to Margaret. I mean, she would just have these horrible visceral dreams and kind of shake around, but that was it. And so, like he had been doing the past couple of weeks, Eric just reached over and gently put his hands on his wife's shoulders and began repeating her name very gently over and over again to try to kind of get her out of this trance she was in. And sure enough, a moment later, Margaret, who kind of stopped flailing, she let out this huge gasp, and then she sat up straight and panted for air, and she turned to her husband, and she said, "I saw the ghost again." And when Eric heard this, he wasn't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." Instead, he was just kind of annoyed. And so he did his best to comfort her, but he's just thinking, what in the world is going on here? So a few years ago, Margaret had joined the spiritualism movement, which was a very popular religious movement at the time. And spiritualists thought they could contact the dead. Now, Eric absolutely did not believe in ghosts, and he was pretty sure that Margaret's staunch belief in spiritualism was now effectively causing these nightmares, that it was not the house, it was just her belief system. It was kind of manifesting in these nightmares. However, Margaret felt the opposite. She felt like it was the house itself that was haunted. And it was haunted by a vengeful spirit that attacked her every night in these dreams. Now, Eric, it's the middle of the night, he's tired, he's annoyed. He didn't feel like discussing whatever she believed about this ghost right now. So after she said, I saw the ghost, I saw the spirit again, he just told her to, calm down, go back to sleep. But on this night, Margaret didn't lie down. She actually turned to Eric and she said, "No, I have to figure out what's going on. I have to figure out who this ghost is and why they're haunting me." A week later, a very resigned Eric sat at his kitchen table next to Margaret, and across from them sat a medium, which is a person who spiritualists believed could talk directly to the dead by conducting a ritual called a seance. The medium began to light some candles, and as they did, they told Eric and Margaret to close their eyes because she was ready to begin the seance, where she would ask the spirit haunting their house what it wanted, and they needed, silence and their eyes closed to do that. So Eric fully believed that this seance would be a waste of time and money. He didn't believe in this stuff at all. But he knew his wife did, and it meant a lot to her. And so he's thinking, maybe this can help my wife sleep through the night again. And so Margaret and Eric did as they were told. And Eric, he closed his eyes and he listened as the medium began clearly rocking back and forth in her chair and began sort of dramatically calling out to the ghost and telling him to reveal himself. And at first, nothing happened, which was exactly what Eric had expected. But after a minute, Margaret suddenly jumped up from the table and ran out of the kitchen across the living room. And Eric, not knowing any better, just got up and followed her. And Margaret, she ran down the hallway and she threw open a door that led down to their cellar and she raced down the steps. Now, Eric was doing his best not to ridicule what was happening here and just to play along. But it's like, what is his wife doing? What's happening here? And so as he's chasing after his wife, he starts saying like, "Honey, what's going on here? Where are you going? What is this?" But she didn't respond. It was like she was on a mission. And then finally, when Eric got down the steps and he's in the cellar, he saw his wife, who was now standing in the middle of the cellar with her arms out wide. And slowly, she began to point to a spot on the floor. And in this really weird and hollow voice with this sort of vacant expression on her face, she told Eric to dig. Now at this point, Eric was totally freaked out. Not because he believed that the seance had worked or that there was a ghost here, but because his wife genuinely was acting totally bizarre. I mean, she was acting possessed. And even if that was an act, it was a terrifying one. And so he just said no. There was no way he was just gonna start digging up the cellar floor. Like, what is going on here? But then the medium came rushing down the stairs as well. And they said that Margaret was in a trance, that the ghost in this house was channeling her, and that basically Eric had to do whatever the ghost said. Suddenly, Margaret's voice cut across the room again, and she said to Eric to dig up the floor. And this time she was more forceful and almost desperate, like, "You must do this." And so Eric, he's looking at his wife, he's looking at the medium, like, what in the world is happening here? But he's like, you know what? I don't know what's happening. I'm just gonna dig. I'm gonna do what they tell me to. So he grabbed a shovel and just began digging up the cellar. And after just a few minutes, Eric's shovel hit something in the ground, something hard. He thought it was just maybe like a big rock or something. But a few minutes later, after he and the medium and also Margaret, who's now come over at this point, they'd kind of cleared off whatever it was, they saw in the ground, what had previously been covered by the earth, was this rotten wooden box. And so he and Margaret and the medium, they pulled it out of the hole and they opened up the lid. And all three of them immediately recoiled because inside of the box was a human skeleton. And so after a minute of just, again, stunned silence, Eric just looked up at Margaret, who did not seem shocked by what she was looking at. This was like confirmation in some ways. And he says to Margaret, is this the skeleton of the ghost that's been haunting you? And Margaret, with that same hollow voice, like it wasn't her voice, looked at Eric and just said, no. It would turn out, according to the story that has been passed down about whatever happened in this house, that the ghost was a doctor who used to live in the house that Eric and Margaret moved into. And 18 years earlier, this doctor had performed an illegal surgery on a young woman, and this woman had died during this procedure. But again, because this surgery had been illegal, the doctor knew if word of what happened here got out, he would be arrested. So what did he do? He dismembered the girl's body and shoved it into this wooden box, filled the box with quicklime, and then he buried it in his basement. And amazingly, the doctor never got caught for what he did. And so he basically spent the rest of his life feeling very ashamed and guilty. And then finally, when he did die, it was like his spirit couldn't actually rest until he confessed. And so this haunting was basically to get Margaret to go down into the basement and see what he had done. One afternoon in April of 1925, a wealthy teenager named Lacey raced his horse around the huge estate where he lived in eastern Hungary and took in all the land that he knew he would inherit someday. He stopped when he reached the gardens on the far side of the estate, but before he could ride his horse into the gardens as he wanted to, a field worker ran up to Lacey and asked him to stop and turn around. The field worker, who was about Lacey's age, explained that Lacey was not allowed to ride his horse through the garden anymore because the last time he had rode through some flower beds and Lacey's father was really mad about it. And at this, Lacey felt totally exasperated because he was tired of his father always bossing him around. And it embarrassed him to be reminded of this by someone as low class as a field worker. So Lacey's family was part of the noble class. His dad was a baron and his mother was a baroness, and they lived together in an old castle on this beautiful estate. And for the most part, Lacey loved his noble life, but his father could be harsh and really controlling. And sometimes Lacey dreamed of the day that he would inherit his dad's title, because then he, Lacey, would be in charge of the estate and he could finally run things the way he wanted. And so Lacey decided he wanted to show his father and this field worker and the other field workers that they couldn't order him around all the time. And so he rode his horse right into the gardens and intentionally rode all over their prized flower beds. Lacey's plan was to head back home and go into the castle and talk to his father about that field worker's rudeness. But when Lacey got back to the castle, he didn't have a chance to even speak to his father, because that whole day his dad was very busy with estate matters. And then that night, his father died of a heart attack. A week after his father's death, Lacey walked through the crowded banquet hall in his family's castle looking for his mother, because he wanted to make sure that she was okay. He and his mom had just gotten home from his dad's funeral, and now they were hosting a reception for everyone who had attended. But Lacey couldn't find his mother anywhere inside of this banquet hall. And with a sinking feeling, he realized there was only one place she could be. So after Lacey's father had died, his mother had gone a little bit crazy. She refused to believe that her husband had died of a heart attack and instead kept insisting that he had been murdered. More specifically, she thought he had been scared to death because when she had seen his body for the first time, his facial expression looked horrified, like he was actually scared as he died. Now, the doctor had explained to her that it was entirely possible that his heart attack came on suddenly and he was scared about what was happening to him and so, was scared when he died. But the Baroness wouldn't listen. She said this was intentional. Somebody did this to him. And so ever since, she had basically spent all of her time in Lacey's father's bedroom searching for clues about her husband's supposed killer. So now, Lacey left the banquet hall and climbed the stairs up the castle up to his father's bedroom. And just as he suspected, when he knocked on the door, his mom answered, looking totally frantic. Lacey told her to come downstairs and say hello to their guests, but she said no, that she was too busy looking for evidence. Then, before Lacey could say anything, his mom just shut the door in his face. The next 6 months went by basically the same way. Lacey's mother spent all her time locked up in the Baron's bedroom around the clock, and Lacey spent most of his time riding his horse, including in the garden, because he didn't like going home anymore. His mother was now technically in charge of the family estate, but she had really let things go since her husband had died. She basically had not taken up any of the responsibilities that she was now in charge of. And so at this point, Lacey really couldn't wait until he was on his own and in charge of the castle and the estate himself. One night in mid-October, so this is at the 6-month mark from when Lacey's father had died, Lacey ate dinner alone, which was common at this point since his mom basically still refused to come downstairs at all. And then after he ate dinner, Lacey began making his way upstairs to get ready for bed. And as he walked upstairs, Lacey just felt overcome with anger and desperation and just kind of general angst about the current situation. He longed so desperately to just be alone and in charge of the estate. He hated the current setup with his mother in charge, but not really doing anything. I mean, the whole estate was just falling apart here. But eventually, despite feeling kind of riled up, Lacey, got into bed and closed his eyes and did eventually begin to drift off to sleep. But right after he had fallen asleep, he was suddenly awoken by this ear-piercing scream that was echoing down the hallway. And he realized it was his mother, and she was screaming for help. And so Lacey jumped out of bed and he raced down the hallway to his father's bedroom. And as he ran, other servants were flooding the hallway, racing towards the room as well. And Lacey, he got to the door, he unlocked it, and he rushed inside. And when he got in there, he saw his mother pointing at the foot of the Baron's bed. And she was saying that a demon had appeared in the bedroom and had loomed over her like it wanted to kill her. And so she told Lacey that the demon had to be what scared his father to death. The demon was the murderer. Lacey's mother looked absolutely convinced here. But Lacey, and really all the servants as well, just kind of collectively sighed, because there was obviously no demon at the foot of the bed here. And his mom clearly had just had a bad dream, or, was just basically acting crazy. And so as the servants kind of, went back to their rooms to allow the family to deal with this, Lacey told his mother to just go back to sleep here. And then he turned and walked back down to his room, feeling completely defeated, because to Lacey, his mom was basically losing her mind here, and he had no idea how he was going to help, or really how much longer this current setup was going to last, but this was awful. On both of the next 2 nights, Lacey woke up yet again to the sound of his mother screaming about a demon inside of the Baron's bedroom. And so by the 3rd morning, Lacey had just had enough. He decided he was going to force his mother out of that bedroom and insist that she come downstairs and eat breakfast with him and just act normal for once. However, when he walked to the Baron's bedroom and knocked on the door to speak to his mother, it was not his mom who answered. It was a police detective. Lacey was stunned, and he walked into the bedroom and saw his mother, who was standing there with 2 more detectives. And Lacey asked, what's going on here? Lacey's mother explained that she had called the police to help her catch the demon that was haunting her at night and very likely was responsible for killing her husband. And at this point, Lacey thought he might die of embarrassment. I mean, this was unbelievable that now the police were involved. But instead of talking about that, he just begged his mother to please send the police home. They do not need to be here. But his mother refused. She was fully committed to the idea that there was a demon here and the police were going to help her find it. And the police, to be honest, looked like they didn't really know what was going on. They were just kind of trying to figure out if this was serious or not, or if there was some sort of intruder, but they were just kind of like, well, we'll see. And so Lacey finally just turned, left, hopped on his horse, and went for his daily ride. That night, as Lacey crawled into his own bed, he knew that down the hallway, his mom was already in bed, and that 3 detectives were watching over her room in case a demon appeared. Again, Lacey felt unbelievably embarrassed by this. To even be affiliated with this was just excruciating, but he managed to close his eyes and go to sleep. But, like normal, at some point in the middle of the night, he woke up because his mother was screaming. And Lacey, he's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. It's only getting worse. But he got out of bed, he went into the hallway, and he began walking down towards where his mother was, where she was screaming inside of the Baron's bedroom, expecting that, once again, the room would be empty and the police would see, this is just complete delusion here. There's no demon, there's no problem. However, when Lacey got to the doorway and looked inside, he saw one of the detectives running across the room and then tackle something that really did look like a demon to the floor. And then Lacey's mother turned on the light. It would turn out that even though Lacey fully expected to inherit his father's title, he was actually not the Baron's firstborn son. Before the Baron had met the Baroness, Lacey's mother, he'd had a relationship with a local peasant woman, and they had had a son together. And the Baron had given that peasant woman a plot of land on the edge of the estate to raise their son in secret. And then the Baron had basically abandoned them both. He had given them the opportunity to, work on the estate and sort of make a living for themselves, but functionally, he didn't interact with them at all. He didn't recognize them at all. They were on their own. Now, the peasant woman, the mother of this child, had sort of accepted that this was their reality, but the secret son had sort of buried that feeling forever until Lacey rode his horse through the gardens despite being told not to and destroyed those flower beds. Because the secret son was that field worker. His job was looking out for the gardens, and it just felt like a step too far. And so the secret son, the field worker, decided he was going to teach this family a lesson. He was going to kill the Baron and the Baroness by scaring them to death. That was his plan. And it sort of worked. He went into the castle and pretended to be a demon in the middle of the night, and he scared the father, the Baron, so badly, he literally had a heart attack and died. However, the secret son continued pretending to be a demon around the Baroness after killing the Baron, and the Baroness would get really, really scared and would scream and claim there's a demon in here. But she didn't die from this. She did not have a heart attack. And so ultimately, the plan was foiled. And so in the end, there was no demon. It was just Lacey's half-brother wrapped in a cloak, wearing a horrifying mask. One morning in early August of 1927, a 24-year-old woman named Inez Perry walked in the back door of the farmhouse where her parents lived in rural Vermont. And as soon as she walked in, she went into the kitchen where her father was at the kitchen table with a man she had never seen before, and the two were shaking hands, and she heard her father say, "We have a deal." And then right after that, Inez's father looked over and saw her, and he explained that this man's name was Clarence Sinclair, and that he and Clarence had just agreed to swap houses. And for a second, Inez was confused, but then it all clicked into place. So Inez's parents had raised her and her other three siblings in this farmhouse, but Inez and her siblings had all moved away, and her parents were getting older. Her dad's health in particular was starting to fail, and keeping up the farmhouse was getting to be too much for him. And so her father had been trying to sell the property for a while, but nobody seemed to want it. However, now it seemed like he had finally found a solution. Her dad explained to her that Clarence and his family would move into this farmhouse and take over the farm. And in exchange, he and Inez's mom would move into Clarence's house just a few towns over. Now, to Inez, this arrangement did seem a little strange, but it also did solve her parents' problem. And so even though she was going to be sad to say goodbye to her childhood home, she decided that this had to be the right move for her parents. And so she said, "That's great." A few weeks later, Inez was inside of her parents' new house, helping to get them settled in and organize their living room, when she heard the clattering sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming down the street and coming to a stop right outside. So she walked to the door and she opened it up, but the second she saw who it was that was getting out of the carriage, she slammed the door and locked it. Because the person getting out of that carriage was Clarence Sinclair, the man who Inez's dad had swapped homes with. And the home swap had not gone how Inez and her family had hoped. Inez's parents were thrilled with their new house, so everything on their side was good. But pretty much immediately after actually doing the swap, Clarence had started acting totally unhinged. He had come back to his old home repeatedly without being invited, and he would beg Inez's dad to switch houses back, that he had made a horrible mistake. But Clarence would never elaborate. He would never really explain why he felt this way. He would just, demand, "Please, I've made a horrible mistake. We have to switch back." But Inez's dad had said no. A deal was a deal, and he just had too many health issues to live at that farmhouse anymore. And Clarence couldn't actually cite any real problems with the farmhouse that he so desperately wanted to, give back. And so as far as Inez's dad was concerned, the subject here was closed. He had not given him a faulty property, and there was no real reason here to go back to the way it was, and so it was a no. So now Inez and her parents watched from the window as Clarence hopped out of his wagon and came rushing onto the porch, and he looked absolutely crazy. His hair was messed up and greasy, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he really looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. And Clarence promptly began pounding on the front door, shouting that his family could not live in their farmhouse, and that this was now a matter of life and death. But eventually, when Inez and her family refused to come out, Clarence finally gave up, turned around, got in his wagon, and drove away. Now, that was the last time that Clarence came to their house, but it was not the last time that Inez and her family would hear about their old farmhouse. A few weeks later, on November 4th, after several days of very heavy rainfall, Inez picked up the newspaper and saw that their old neighborhood had been basically washed away by historic flooding, and that included their old farmhouse. It had literally been carried off, and the family that had been living in the farmhouse were dead. But that family was not Clarence Sinclair's family. It would turn out that after Clarence and his family had moved into said farmhouse, Clarence began having these horrible dreams where his dead mother would appear to him and tell him to move out of this farmhouse right now because something terrible is going to happen here. Now, at first, Clarence ignored this and chalked it up to a bad dream, but the dream kept happening over and over and over again, and it was driving him mad. And so eventually, he did go to Inez and Inez's parents and tried to switch it back because he felt like this dream really meant something. But Inez's father just kept saying no and said, no, that's your house now. And so Clarence never elaborated to the family about why he wanted this back because it made no sense to him either, but he ultimately listened to his dead mother in his dream, and he wound up just selling the farmhouse just to not live there anymore. And so that decision would ultimately save Clarence and his family. But it would also condemn to death the family who moved in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch.